to see you all. Griffith University acknowledges the people who are the traditional custodians of the land. The university pays respects to the elders, past and present, and extends that respect to other Indigenous Australians. If I could ask before we begin that you turn off your phones or put them on silent, because not only will it affect the audience here, but we're being live streamed on YouTube tonight. Now, first of all, I would like to welcome invited guests. Mr. Alan McSporran QC, Chair of the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission, Inspector Ray Brownhill from the Queensland Police Service and the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here at Griffith. Guests, colleagues, students and friends, I'm delighted tonight to introduce Jason as the latest in our list of distinguished lectures. These lectures over the past few years have canvassed issues both profound and practical. We've heard of the challenges of democratic leadership, the changes in executive government, and most recently been asked by Professor Renee Jeffrey to choose between justice and reconciliation in post-conflict situations. But tonight we're being introduced to the murky world of dark money by our colleague and friend, Professor Jason Sharman. Jason joined Griffith 10 years ago in 2007, coming from the University of Sydney. He took his bachelor's degree at the University of Western Australia before travelling to the US for a master's and PhD at the University of Illinois, where he got his very sound and rigorous grounding in methodology. A little more of that later on. Jason's list of publications, and I was flicking through the pages, is far too long to talk about. And I was even puzzled at picking out some highlights. Should I go for the books with the catchy titles? The Money Laundry, Global Shell Games, The Puppet Master, or most recently The Despot's Guide? Or should I in fact be serious and academic and mention some of the journal articles which have become the touchstones, the cited references in any review of methodology, any PhD student's chapter, and so on? His productivity, his excellence has been recognised in numerous awards, prizes. He's a member of the Australian Academy of Social Science. He's a sought-after consultant for governments, not-for-profit organisations and international organisations looking for ways to deal with this problem of dark money. But I think in the end what makes Jason stand out for me is the combination of that methodological toughness with the sheer audacity of his research projects. And I'm left thinking, you asked them that? You thought, what? How could you do such things? So I give to you tonight, Jason.
Thanks very much, first off, to my colleague Robin Hollander for that very kind introduction, and then thanks to everyone for coming along this evening. The talk I'm giving is based on the forthcoming book of the same name, and the book examines what I think has been a big and important recent change in international politics, just over the last 2 decades. There's a new moral and legal rule prohibiting one country from hosting the wealth stolen by the leaders of another country. 20 years ago, if, hypothetically, the leader of Malaysia or Ukraine or Egypt stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his own country and put it in a Swiss bank account, Switzerland would have no moral or legal duty to do anything about this situation, to either stop or reverse this inward flow of illicit wealth. Now, under this new rule, Switzerland does have a moral and legal duty to stop foreign corruption proceeds from entering the country, or to the extent that these funds do enter the country, the Swiss government obligated to seize it and perhaps to repatriate it. This change is important for at least a couple of reasons. First off, we do know that the leaders of predominantly poor countries steal billions and billions of dollars and transfer that money into rich countries, thereby further impoverishing some of the world's already poorest population. Secondly, given that most of the world's states are governed by thugs or thieves, to the extent that the international community does indeed hold leaders responsible for their corruption, this really marks a sea change in the conduct of international diplomacy and international relations more generally. The talk starts a long way away from us here in Brisbane, but ends up very close to home indeed, as I argue that Australia and Queensland are in fact havens for dirty money from abroad, specifically the proceeds of foreign corruption. So to begin with, quite an obscure country, a very long way from us, on the other side of the world, Equatorial Guinea in West Africa, which I argue is an exemplar of the problem I'm talking about. This small West African country of 700,000 people has rather a tragic history, beginning with its independence from Spain in 1968. Its first ruler, Francisco Macias, established a brutal dictatorship. He banned the word intellectual, executed anyone with glasses, closed down all hospitals, banned Western medicine, put landmines to prevent his people escaping the country, and destroyed all boats and ships. During the time of his dictatorship, about a third of the population was killed or fled, earning Equatorial Guinea the nickname of the Dachau of Africa. When Macias began killing members of his own family, however, in 1979, he was overthrown by his nephew, Teodoro Obiang. In the mid-1990s, this desperately poor country seemed to have a much-needed change of fortune. Oil was discovered in the ocean, in the sea just off Equatorial Guinea. Massive oil fields, so that now Equatorial Guinea is Africa's third largest oil producer, after only Nigeria and Angola. The vast income from these new oil discoveries meant that the size of the economy quadrupled overnight. And the per capita wealth of Equatorial Guinea has risen to roughly the same level as Spain or Italy. But something strange has happened, or rather hasn't happened. Despite all this wealth, average people haven't got any richer. The majority of the population still doesn't have access to running water 20 years after this oil find. And in fact, 3/4 of the population lives on under $2 a day. By some estimates, life expectancy has actually declined since the discovery of oil. What's going on here? Where has all the money gone? A broad hint as to where the money is going is provided by a 2012 indictment of the president of Equatorial Guinea's son by the US Department of Justice. On an official salary of $80,000, the president's son managed to go on an extraordinary shopping spree over 7 years. And this is what he bought, or at least some of what he bought. His purchases include an $80 million mansion in Paris, after renovations valued at double this figure, a $30 million mansion in Malibu, California, next door neighbours with Britney Spears, a third mansion in Sao Paulo for $15 million, a $38.5 million Gulfstream jet, 2 mega yachts with a down payment on another 280-foot yacht containing an internal shark tank, 5 Rolls Royces, a Maserati, 2 Ferraris, 4 Bugattis, 2 Bentleys. He spent $44 million on fine art, $14 million on antiques, $20 million at Yves Saint Laurent's estate auction. He bought 4 wristwatches, each one of which was worth more than $1 million. He spent $5 million on wine, and finally, he spent $1.8 million on Michael Jackson memorabilia, the centerpiece of which was a $275,000 crystal-studded white glove from the Bad Tour. And you can see that actually the US Department of Justice case against it is called the United States of America versus this glove. So in 7 years, you can see the president's son spent an incredible total of $314 million. The US government took action against Obiang's assets, including the glove, but in some sense this is a surprise. Why would, logically, the United States care if the son of some foreign despot were, for argument's sake, to steal and spend this amount of money? Why does it affect the United States? It reflects the fact that since the 1990s, there have been a slew of international anti-corruption agreements. capped by the UN Convention Against Corruption, passed in 2005. This kind of looting that I've described is not especially new. Grand corruption has been around as long as we've really had a separation between public and private money. So why has it recently come to prominence? Why is it now seen, or the last couple of decades, why is grand corruption seen as a policy problem to be solved, instead of, as previously, as just a fact of life? The rise of the international anti-corruption movement in the 1990s, I argue, was a product of two big changes. First off, organisations like the World Bank and other development agencies had to explain why their development policies weren't working. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the World Bank and others found that despite poor countries following their policy advice, many countries were not getting richer, and indeed some were getting poorer. The answer for this was that corruption, or more euphemistically, a lack of good governance, was sapping development potential, keeping countries poor. Corruption was and is seen as the flip side of poverty, and indeed a cause of poverty. The development failure is a reflection of the kleptocracy of their ruling elites. Equatorial Guinea being a classic example, but there being many others. Second reason is the big geopolitical change that of course happened around about the same time, the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War lessened the need for the United States and the West in general to continue their existing policy of supporting thoroughly corrupt but also reliably anti-communist dictators in the Third World. Whether it was people like the Marcos regime in the Philippines, the Duvaliers in Haiti, or Mobutu in Zaire, the logic was the United States and others didn't really care about how much these rulers stole or what damage this caused to their local economy, as long as they kept out the Soviets and communist client states. A central premise of this new system, the UN Convention Against Corruption, is that corruption in poor countries will remain a continuing problem as long as rich countries are willing to play host to the loot. And so hence this new rule that I mentioned, prohibiting countries from hosting wealth stolen by the leaders of other countries. Australia and almost every other country in the world has committed to this rule, and indeed committed to it several times over. So if the UN Convention is in some ways the global one, the most comprehensive one, there are a variety of regional agreements of hard and soft law as well. Okay, why does grand corruption have this international cast? Why is it that we see leaders of poor countries not only steal, which is understandable, but then why do they move money across borders? First off, any time in financial crime that money is moved across borders, this complicates investigation and detection. Despite maybe a century of cooperation between police departments in different countries, mutual legal assistance works surprisingly badly. It's slow, it's expensive, it's laboursome. Secondly, rich countries provide for despots from poor countries opportunities for conspicuous consumption, buying the mansion, buying the Ferraris, going on incredible spending binges of clothes, high living, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, it provides an insurance policy. If you're a despot, your rule is often insecure. To the extent that you have a nice place set up in Paris or London, or indeed even in Australia, if your political fortunes turn at home, it means you have a comfortable refuge or safe haven to go to. Lastly, these despots, these kleptocrats, have a rather strange relationship with the rule of law. Obviously thoroughly corrosive and subversive of the rule of law at home, they tend to value the rule of law in countries that end up hosting their wealth. If you've gone to the trouble to steal money, you don't want it being stolen from you in turn. Jointly, these factors explain the connection between faraway, obscure countries like Equatorial Guinea and more familiar locations like London, New York, Paris, Switzerland, but indeed Australia also, as we shall see. So, if you're a despot, how do you beat the system that's designed to stop you? If we've got rules like the UN Convention Against Corruption and so on for the last 10 years, as a despot, how do you beat these rules? An example of how not to do it is provided by the ex-wife of Sani Abacha, dictator of Nigeria, who died in 1998. Shortly after his death, his wife, Mariam Abacha, was stopped at an airport in Nigeria with 38 suitcases filled with cash to the value of $66 million US. Cash is incredibly heavy. $1 million in shrink-wrapped $100 bills in the United States weighs between 8 or 9 kilos, depending on the amount of moisture in the notes. So really, if you are looking to steal and transport large amounts of money, cash is not the way to go. Instead, there are 3 elements that are necessary. The first off is a foreign bank account that can receive international wire transfers. The second is a shell company to hide the trail. Thirdly, you would need an ethically flexible lawyer to process the transactions, set up the shell company, but also generally buy property as well, given that real estate purchases are a great excuse for explaining large transfers of money. So let's take each of these elements in turn. Under the new system of rules, banks are meant to be on the lookout for suspicious funds. They're meant to report and refuse criminal money. But we have good evidence that banks don't always do what they meant to do, especially, of course, because banks have a strong financial incentive to accept lucrative new business without asking difficult questions. So we have one African despot, again, Abacha's 26-year-old son could manage to deposit $214 million with Credit Suisse without arousing their suspicions at the source of the wealth, or even without Credit Suisse establishing the true identity of the dictator's son. A British report from 2011 found that many banks in London just didn't fill out the portion of the forms that are meant to screen clients to establish the source of their wealth. Whereas other British banks explained on the form that clients were above suspicion because, quote, they came from a respectable family or were, quote, nice. Lawyers or real estate agents' trust accounts are also another great way of getting illegal money into the country, given that both of these trust accounts commingle or mix funds from different clients, then it can be very hard for people to look into it and find exactly whose money belongs to who. Shell companies. Okay, how are shell companies different from normal companies? They're those that have no substantive business purpose, but can be used to hold a bank account, property, or other asset so as to obscure the real identity of the living, breathing individual in control. Well, how would you get a shell company? Well, from a mystery shopping exercise I did earlier, I got the following reply when I emailed a provider offering to sell me a shell company linked to a bank account. And the reply went as follows. Dear Mr. Sharman, the anonymous structure we offer is totally secure since we manage the bank account on behalf of the owner. The owner's name appears nowhere. Using this structure, no investigator could determine the true ownership of the structure. We offer additional security by the fact that we could change the nature of the structure and relocate it to other jurisdictions literally within minutes if required. Having said that, we should make it very clear that we will not engage in any illegal practices on behalf of clients. However, what is illegal in one country may not be illegal in another. Lawyers and real estate. How hard is it to find an ethically flexible lawyer? Perhaps a trick question. I'll give you an Australian example a bit later on. Speaking on the record to the New York Times in 2014, one US lawyer selling New York real estate was asked about the danger of his client's money being the product of foreign corruption. He replied as follows, "It's something that's never discussed, but it's the elephant in the room. Real estate is a wonderful way to cleanse money. Once you buy real estate, the derivation of that cash is forgotten." One of his colleagues helpfully explained, like somebody said, Karl Marx or whatever, if the capitalist is going to see a triple return, he's going to close his eyes. In 2016, an undercover team from the NGO Global Witness secretly recorded lawyers, again in New York, including the then president of the American Bar Association, explaining on how to import foreign corruption funds into the US. Once again, they recommended a combination of international wire transfers, shell companies, and real estate. Okay, despite these obvious holes in the system and failure, it's important to state that at the moment, kleptocrats are not having things all their own way, that some of them are falling afoul of the rules, that the system has some level of effectiveness. So here, going back to Obiang of Equatorial Guinea fame, you can see that several of his luxury cars are being carted away by law enforcement here. And indeed, his $30 million Malibu mansion next door to Britney Spears has been seized by the US government. Obiang's still at large and still has most of his goodies, including the Michael Jackson glove, but there is some partial accountability there. This man, Prime Minister of Najib of Malaysia, has a lot of explaining to do at the moment after $4 billion went missing from Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund. And shortly afterwards, $681 million was deposited into Najib's personal account, supposedly a gift from an anonymous Saudi royal. Some of the money ended up buying fine art, being spent on New York real estate, and some of it, appropriately enough, was used to finance the film The Wolf of Wall Street. The Malaysian Prime Minister has successfully destroyed the investigation in Malaysia. However, because of this international rule, this investigation continues in 7 other countries, with over $1 billion of assets frozen so far. In the roughly 10 years since we've had the new system of rules countering kleptocracy, or at least prohibiting the hosting of foreign corruption proceeds, about $5 billion of assets have been recovered. So we know effectiveness is not zero, but we certainly know it's not perfect. It's not 100%. So what can we actually say about effectiveness? The bulk of the book is a comparison of 4 countries, the United States, Britain, and Switzerland. And it tries to assess the extent to which they're living up to their commitment to prevent foreign corruption funds entering the financial system. And to the extent that those funds do enter the financial system, to what extent do the governments of these 4 countries succeed in tracing, seizing, and returning these funds? In the book, I find that the United States, Britain, and Switzerland are generally sincere in respecting their international commitment, although because this is a particularly tough policy problem, the overall effectiveness of the rule against hosting the proceeds of corruption is incomplete. It's not great. Australia, however, is in a completely different category, in that the Australian government has consistently chosen a path of inaction and denial that has led to this country being a haven for dirty money stolen by foreign leaders and their families. This is obviously a rather serious accusation, so what evidence is there to support this charge? Let's start with China. The Chinese regime has long been plagued by endemic corruption amongst its leadership, and indeed since his accession to power in December 2012, Xi Jinping has launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign. People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, put together a top-secret report on senior Chinese leaders fleeing that country with stolen state assets. The report was so good that it won an internal prize for the quality of its research. But what good is a prize if no one knows about it? Against strict orders, the proud authors posted the report on the web in 2011. It was taken down within a few hours, but it was widely copied in the time that it was on the web. The report indicated that in the 15-year period from 1998 to 2008, something between 16,000 and 18,000 senior officials fled China, taking funds to the value of between $100 and $120 billion with them. That's billion with a B, not million with an M. Where did these officials go, and where did they take the money? The report lists the 3 most popular destinations for these officials and their money as being the United States, Canada, and Australia. More generally, in 2013, an OECD report ranked its 34 member states on how well they measured up with international standards on blocking the flow of corruption proceeds from abroad. Out of 34, Australia came 33rd. The Australian government then tried to have this unflattering comparison cut from the report. It failed. The Australian government then tried to suppress the fact that it had tried to suppress the comparison. Failed at that too. In 2015, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the world's global anti-money laundering standard setter and enforcer, assessed this country in terms of anti-money laundering standards. And in the report released April last year, it raised troubling questions about Queensland. The report quotes as follows: "While money laundering of foreign illicit proceeds through real estate is perceived to be a risk for Queensland, particularly the Gold Coast, Queensland has no money laundering convictions for this activity. The Australian Federal Police indicated that it does not focus on this risk, believing this money laundering activity relates to state-level crimes, whereas the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission states that it also does not focus on this risk as it relates to foreign money and is thus a matter for the Australian Federal Police. The federal agencies think that it's a state issue, the state agencies think that it's a federal issue. nothing is done. Why hasn't the Australian government taken action here? I suggest in the book it's a problem of strong laws but weak will. Australia has some of the strongest laws in the world for confiscating the proceeds of crime and for prosecuting those crimes. In some circumstances, the law in Australia, both state and federal, allows for a reversal of proof, in that you have to prove you obtained your money legally rather than the government having to prove that you obtained it illegally to confiscate it. So the real problem, as I say, is just political will. Australian governments of both the left and the right have consistently taken the attitude that it is politically easier to brazen it out and deny there is a problem rather than admit the fact that Australia is a haven for dirty money and to do something to address this problem. Okay, so again, a little more detail. How does the dirty money get into Australia? How does it get into Queensland? First off, I refer to a speech in 2012 by Sam Coyne, who was head of Papua New Guinea's anti-corruption task force sweep, on a trip, I might add, that was paid for by Griffith University. Coyne spoke of the activities of corrupt officials in Papua New Guinea in Australia as follows. He says, "They have bought property and other assets, put money in bank accounts and gambled heavily in your casinos, and have never been troubled by having their ill-gotten gains taken off them. Be under no illusion. These people have chosen Australia as their preferred destination to launder and house the proceeds of their crimes because it is easy. Cairns is only a short flight from Port Moresby, and property can be bought off the plan without permission. The financial system is stable, and it has been extremely easy to get their money into your system." Sam Coyne has since issued an arrest warrant for the current Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, which is still current. Coyne came up with the idea of Australia as being the Cayman Islands of the South Pacific. And for the record, I have to say, I think this comparison, though, is very unfair to the Cayman Islands. And indeed, I got an email this morning from someone in the Cayman Islands, the former head of the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, protesting, I think very reasonably, that in fact the Cayman Islands does a far better job than Australia when it comes to confiscating and stopping the inflow of proceeds of crime. Australia has never repatriated a single cent of corruption funds to Papua New Guinea, despite someone from the Australian Federal Police estimating that about $200 million of corruption funds from Papua New Guinea flow into Australia each year. Okay, a little more specific. Have a look at this gentleman here, Aris Watoto. Watoto colluded with a Papua New Guinean minister to steal millions of dollars of public funds intended for schools, among other purposes. Finding out that he was about to be charged with corruption offences in Papua New Guinea, Watoto fled to Cairns in August 2011. He used a car hire company he owned to sponsor him for an Australian work visa, 457 visa, arguing successfully that there was a shortage of managerial talent in Cairns, therefore that he would be a valuable addition to the Australian economy. The PNG government requested the Australian government not to issue the visa, considering the pending charges. The Australian government chose to ignore the request, despite a secret cable from Australia's High Commissioner in Port Moresby to then Foreign Minister Bob Carr, warning that this decision could be used to, quote, prove that Australia is a haven for the proceeds of crime from PNG. Watoto has set up a variety of bank accounts, bought 5 properties, continued to operate his car hire company. The corruption charges, then public knowledge, were no obstacle to him accessing the Australian banking system, buying property, running a business. The Papua New Guinea government asked the Australian government that Watoto be returned to PNG to face the charges, but the Australian government agreed with Watoto's lawyers that he was too sick to travel, suffering from fatigue, even though the Australian government records at the time showed Watoto travelling to Fiji, Indonesia, the Solomon Islands and other countries. 2 Fairfax journalists broke the story almost 2 years later, on the same day that then Prime Minister Julia Gillard touched down in Port Moresby for an official visit. By a miraculous coincidence, Watoto's visa was cancelled that week and he returned to face trial, though again, not 1 cent of his proceeds have been returned to Papua New Guinea. Finally, getting even closer to home, what about the ethically flexible lawyers I mentioned earlier? They're right here in Brisbane. In 2014, I spoke with an undercover investigator from the same NGO I mentioned earlier, Global Witness, who went to Papua New Guinea under the pretense of asking local lawyers how to bring corruption funds into Australia. And then this undercover investigator secretly videoed the exchange. The video is available on YouTube. The footage was later broadcast on SBS. One Australian lawyer in Port Moresby and former Crown prosecutor, I might add, helpfully explained, "You know, the days of banging $1 million into the secret numbered bank account in Singapore is over. Dribs and drabs are the only way to go." His partner then set up another helpful scheme about how to get money, corruption proceeds into this country and into Queensland in particular. The system works by, and I might add that this other lawyer is also a fairly close associate of the current Prime Minister. The Australian-based lawyer provides fictitious or inflatus legal bills to a PNG politician who has corruption money that he then wants to put into Australia. This is explained as being legal services, and either there are no legal services at all or it's inflated. Because the Australian-based law firm is prestigious and because you have this cover story for the money, then it doesn't really attract any suspicion from the Australian authorities. Once the money has arrived in the lawyer's trust firm, and trust account rather, the lawyer takes a cut of the proceeds, but most of it's kicked back to the PNG politician, either through an Australian bank account or a shell company or perhaps a property. The Brisbane lawyer named in that footage, which I certainly won't name here, is still practicing. His offices are just under 2 kilometres away from where I'm speaking now. Okay, the penultimate section. What can we do to make the system work better? Clearly, without political will, nothing much can be done. So unless the Australian government has a change of heart. But if the Australian government does have a change of heart, what can we learn from countries like the United States, Britain and Switzerland about how to make the system work more successfully, about how to be more successful in parting kleptocrats from the ill-gotten gains? First off, it's important to turn this problem from no one's problem into someone's problem in particular. I mentioned that in Australia, the problem has tended to fall between the cracks. Not only the state-based agencies blame the federal agencies, but you have groups like the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Crime Commission, and AUSTRAC, Australia's money laundering, anti-money laundering unit, who each tend to say that it's the other's responsibility. Contrast this with the experience of the United States, where the Department of Justice has set up a dedicated anti-kleptocracy unit. And this is the one responsible for confiscating some of Obiang's wealth, such as the $30 million mansion. In the experience of the UK, you have the very innovative solution of the Department for International Development has actually given money to the National Crime Agency in the UK in order for them to look for foreign corruption proceeds in London. Once those proceeds are seized and confiscated, then they're then returned to the country of origin, the victim country, and counted as extra development aid. So the development agency is in fact funding 50 policemen and investigators in London looking for things like Nigerian corruption proceeds and so on. Finally, in Switzerland, you have a dedicated unit of the Foreign Ministry which is performing the same function and even going so far as to pay private lawyers, private Swiss lawyers, on behalf of victim governments to look for corruption proceeds in Switzerland. The second one would be better policing of gatekeepers. I mentioned that kleptocrats don't move and launder this money unless they're Mariam Abacha, and even she got caught. They don't move and launder this money by themselves. They depend on a class of specialised intermediaries, particularly lawyers, bankers, and to a lesser extent, real estate agents. All of these in each country, including Australia, are covered by the responsibility to screen and report suspicious transactions. But again, another lesson of the book is that these laws and regulations don't enforce themselves. And with the exception of the United States, governments, especially in Australia, have been extremely reluctant to sanction these intermediaries, and particularly banks, for their failures to know their customers properly or to practice customer due diligence. Another solution, raised right here in Brisbane in the 2014 G20 summit, is the denial of entry for these leaders and their families as well. I mentioned that they enjoy high living, conspicuous consumption, that they have a very international lifestyle. And an easy one is just to set up a list of corrupt officials, even if they haven't been convicted in a home country, which for obvious political reasons could be hard, and simply deny them entry. the tax system on the Al Capone precedent. As you remember, Al Capone was not caught for his bootlegging, murders or other crimes, but indeed his tendency to evade income tax. If foreign leaders have assets in Australia, particularly bank accounts, they usually generate some sort of income, and that generates tax obligations. In many countries, in fact in most countries, it's compulsory under tax laws for people to report foreign assets. Kleptocrats rarely do so. So apart from the more obvious solutions of prosecuting them for corruption or money laundering, the tax system provides another powerful instrument against these kinds of criminals. The second last one would be the use of NGOs. I've mentioned groups like Global Witness, and Transparency International has also had a pioneering role in bringing the cause of anti-corruption onto the international agenda. In certain continental European countries, NGOs are able to bring direct lawsuits, either criminal or civil, against the assets of these kleptocrats in a way that's been highly effective when governments have been reluctant for diplomatic or political reasons to take action themselves. Finally, and perhaps the most ambitious, though not out of the question, is somewhat of a coalition between so-called Baptist and bootleggers. That is the idea of fighting corruption for profit. It's hard to drive around Brisbane these days without seeing a billboard from some lawyer saying no win, no fee. And indeed, in some kinds of corruption cases, you do have international legal firms that off their own bat bring private suits against the assets that have been stolen from the country on the idea that if the suit is won, they keep roughly a third of the assets, but if they lose, the poor country, the victim country, is at least no worse off. So to conclude, there are now a lot of recent international rules designed to prohibit one country hosting money by the kleptocratic leaders of another country. Some countries have taken action, and despite severe challenges of policy implementation, countries like the US, Britain and Switzerland have recorded some important successes. If you look at the United States, you have Obiang and some Ukrainian politicians. If you look at Britain, you have Nigerian politicians, and indeed one of the sons of Colonel Gaddafi, who I showed earlier. In Switzerland, you have successful examples like Marcos of the Philippines and Montesinos of Peru. But unfortunately, in our country, the Commonwealth government has simply chosen not to honour its international commitments, meaning that Australia is increasingly a haven for dirty money from abroad, as demonstrated by the evidence I've briefly discussed during this presentation. And thereby, Australia is facilitating the systematic looting of countries in our region and beyond. We need much more pressure on the government from academics, NGOs, the general community, but particularly from the media, in order to force action and generate the sort of political will that has so far been sadly lacking. Until that point, to all you despots out there, you rich huddled kleptocrats yearning to bank free, we can only say, welcome to Australia. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Jason. We now have the opportunity, or at least you do, to ask some questions. There are a couple of roving mics, so if you have a question, where to park your money most profitably, Jason is here to advise.
Hey Jason, thanks. That's a fantastic presentation. I just want to ask a kind of hypocritical, principled question. How can you tell people, I want to think how I can put this in the most righteous way possible, if someone in a developing country wants to pay someone an outrageous amount of money, I mean, I'm not talking about theft, but just pay outrageous amounts of money, that's capitalism. And wouldn't it be possible just to say it may be ridiculous to pay someone incredible amounts of funds, but that's just an easy way to get around it. And likewise, again, just to be incredibly self-righteous, the patron, the client-lawyer relationship, doesn't that have to be sacrosanct? And a lot of sleaze gets hidden under it, but that's a kind of important principle. So what are two kind of responses to those kinds of concerns? And a great presentation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think both of them are really important questions. So first off, I think the the general rule is if it's incompetence or conspiracy, it's probably a conspiracy. It's probably incompetence. But in these countries, I think it is a conspiracy in that it's not just people getting bad value for money and overpaying, in that it is really often quite brazen theft. So the example I mentioned before of Abacha, he literally had soldiers drive up in trucks to the central bank and kind of shovel cash from the central bank into the trucks that were then driven off to another bank and then wired overseas. So there was no real pretense of this is fee for service or so on. Certainly you're right that some of it is more subtle than this. And you can say, well, look, in a world of sovereign states where we have no world government, if sovereign leaders want to spend their money in a way that doesn't seem to be great value for money, you know, surely isn't this the prerogative of sovereign leaders to do as they see fit? And for me, one of the things that's particularly interesting about this is that just in the way that states have got together and said, well, look, sovereign leaders are no longer free to commit genocide or torture or so on, that they've joined together to sign up to human rights conventions, so too these leaders have signed up to the anti-corruption treaties. And as I say, almost every country in the world, including extremely corrupt ones, which in some ways is puzzling. The second one, I think, is not just a question of attorney-client privilege or lawyer-client confidentiality, but the more general safeguards that go with civil liberties in a democratic society, particularly the presumption of innocence. One of the unfortunate things in Australia is we have the worst of both worlds, in that we have extremely strong laws that have very seriously undermined those basic freedoms, the presumption of innocence, confidentiality, and yet we don't have effectiveness against criminals, particularly foreign criminals, but also arguably domestic ones as well. And that one of the problems has been the idea that what we need in Australia are stronger laws, more laws, that it's still too hard to prosecute people, it's still too hard to confiscate property. And as I say, I think that's not the case at all. I would certainly agree that there is a balancing act to be struck between legitimate protections and the ability to get at these kleptocrats' money. I think one of the sad things of anti-money laundering is that you can see dictatorial or even semi-dictatorial governments like Egypt or Russia or China that are using these new laws to persecute dissidents, whether it's Ai Weiwei in China or Sergei Magnitsky in Russia.
A question up the back, Julie. Q.
Thank you, Jason. Very interesting. Jason, what would be an explanation, if not the explanation, for what clearly, or at least seemingly, is the lack of political will in Australia, given that there seems, from at least part of what you said, that there's evidence for the situation?
Sure.
What's the best explanation?
Yeah. Well, first off, I mean, in doing the interviews, I did a lot of interviews for this book, so around about 120 in about 10 countries. And in speaking to the police I mentioned in London, so for the National Crime Authority, they said, look, I mean, if you're talking to people, the voters and the media, the kind of crime they care about is someone comes into your shop and threatens you with a knife and steals the takings of a till. The quote was, British cops are paid by British taxes to solve British crimes. So if Nigerian governors want to steal a lot of money from Nigeria and launder it in the UK, why is that a problem for Britain? Why should, particularly if Britain gets this money, it has to give it back. It can't just say, thanks very much, now it's ours. The idea is you not only seize the money, but you repatriate it to the victim country. So there's a presumption first off is, why is this our problem as a host country? Now again, rhetorically, countries have agreed that it's not good enough. We can't just say, that's your problem, Nigeria, the Philippines, Egypt, whichever the victim country is. Rhetorically, they've endorsed this principle. Why hasn't it happened in Australia? I think in some ways that there's nothing like a really good scandal to catch government's opinion, okay, to make them change their mind, to generate that sort of political will that's been missing so far. So that in Switzerland, you had an increasingly big public relations problem, still there in a lot of ways, where Swiss bank became a shorthand for kind of crime or criminal money. The United States had a series of big scandals as well, Obiang being one of them, but you also had a very independent Senate subcommittee that pushed things, and very, very strong investigative journalists. In Britain, a similar scandal to do with the Abacha money, which I've mentioned a couple of times. So far, We haven't got as big a scandal in Australia of foreign corruption funds here. And we also haven't got victim countries that are prepared to push hard enough in the right way for Australian action. What about Papua New Guinea? Papua New Guinea, unfortunately, the pressure there was sabotaged by the Manus Island deal. And the Australian government decided the Manus Island deal is key. Do not do anything to jeopardise that. And one of the things that would jeopardise that is having a close look at the assets of members of the PNG cabinet, their assets in Australia. So that was not done. Okay. China, the other one that has a lot of money in Australia, has tended to go about things the wrong way. It got some of their police, it gave them tourist visa, they came into Australia and looked up some of the people they were after and said to these people, we know where you are, we're watching you and we can get you. Okay? And they got found out for this, the Chinese. They did the same in Canada and the same in the United States. And part of me thinks that the reason they were found out was because they wanted to be found out, just to send a message to all those people outside of China. But as I say, the lack of a scandal and the lack of the right kind of pressure from victim countries so far is what I think explains the lack of political will and hence the lack of action. Under 2 Ks. You could walk there in half an hour easily.
Jason, 2 more questions about the Australian solution to this, because putting aside the larger question of political will, and this is really 2 questions about the Australian solution. I mean, one is that in terms of the coordination between law enforcement agencies and the technical ability to actually do things like the National Crime Agency or the Swiss are doing, then I'm sure our friends in the Australian government would say the Australian Federal Police Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre has been set up. There's been a huge expansion in attention to these issues, but of course that hasn't been just driven or perhaps hasn't been driven by this issue at all. It's been driven by foreign bribery, and there's a suite of international corruption issues where Australia can be accused of having been asleep at the wheel. So I guess the question is, if there's been a change of guard at AUSTRAC, you would have to hope that things are on the improve. I guess the question is are they on the improve at that technical level? And is there any evidence of that? Because I'm sure that there's plenty of good law enforcement agencies out there that would love to get into this. And so the question is, is it resources? Is it priorities? Whatever. The other question about the Australian end of this is what about the banks? Because presumably in Switzerland, the US and the UK, if you're talking about banks having actually woken up to the fact that they're part of a regime which doesn't allow this sort of thing anymore, then what's happening? I mean, do you support a royal commission into the banks?
Again, for the situation in Australia, it's not a technical problem. It's not a legal problem. It's not even a financial problem. We have lots of law enforcement agencies. They have incredibly strong powers, much more so than their counterparts in the US, Switzerland or Britain. Ironically, that Britain is saying that we need to reform our system so it looks more like the Australian system. I tell them the one that doesn't work and doesn't catch these sort of people. So no, it's not a technical problem. One of the things that surprised me is how sensitive law enforcement agencies are to media coverage and political signals. And the very clear political signals from the Australian government is that it worries about and cares about some sorts of crime, financial crime, and it does not worry about others. Things that it does worry about, the financing of terrorism, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and tax evasion. Things that it does not worry about as much, fraud, credit card fraud, but particularly the foreign corruption proceeds. Okay, you mentioned what about the indicators of change? Well, look, I'm a big believer in evidence, so once I start seeing evidence, I'll start believing. But the Australian government has tended to get this loop or mantra that's just been saying the same thing for 10 years. Australia has a robust AML-CTF scheme, anti-money laundering, countering the terrorism, financing of terrorism scheme. We have seen change in the past, so it is possible for things to go from worse to better. And exactly the example you give of Australian firms bribing abroad, so the corrupt inflows going from Australia outwards instead of from the outside world into Australia. So we had first off the Australian Wheat Board scandal, and then you had these only, of course, found out by a UN investigation after years of stonewalling and denial from the Australian Commonwealth Government. Secondly, you had our Reserve Bank of Australia, 2 controlled companies, note printing Australian security, giving huge, very irregular cash payments to people in 16 different countries in order to buy our polymer note printing technology. Now, I don't even know if I'm allowed to talk about that because there's a gagging order from the courts that says that people can't report too much of the stuff in the media, or at least there has been in the past. So I won't say too much more about that. But at least the upshot of these two unhappy scandals is that after getting grilled for a while, after getting some more scathing international assessments from the OECD, the Australian government did indeed, at the AFP, Australian Federal Police, set up this Fraud and Anti-Corruption Centre and has indeed got about a dozen investigations, I hear, underway. Okay? But again, unless you hold these people's feet to the fire and make inaction more painful than action, they're going to stick with inaction. And inaction is what we have so far when it comes to foreign corruption proceeds in this country.
There's a question at the back.
Thanks, Jason. I'm a politics student. I'm a first year. I study at this uni actually, and one of the things that we actually look at is the Western world foreign policy on R2P, which is the right to protect countries from oppression from the leaders. Mm-hmm. And what we've looked at is mostly this overwhelming focus on the use of that foreign policy on leaders that actually use violence in civil oppressions rather than in the countries that they use laundering and corruption like mm-hmm. this. Now my question is, with this ever-changing situation where countries that are corrupt, moving from using violence to using corruption and money laundering like this, what is do you believe the US and these countries that actually adapted this foreign policy how they should adapt to counter this sort of corruption? Because arguably it is about the same. It can be actually the impact can be a lot worse than using violence on their people. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly I'd say that unfortunately bad things do go together, and that many of the same rulers that are particularly corrupt are also particularly brutal. So that these tends to, if you don't have a rule of law that protects the financial assets of the state, you're probably not going to have a rule of law that protects the citizens of the state. And you can see that to an extent in Russia, to an extent in China, and to a much greater extent in some of the other countries around the world. Okay? So again, you tend to have this correspondence with human rights violators and those engaged in kleptocracy often tend to be the same people. Okay, your question was to what extent, and I should say, unfortunately, in some ways, if you did have people shifting from genocide and torture to quote-unquote just financial crime, it would be a moot point if that represents some kind of improvement. Although the deaths caused by corruption are less direct than dropping barrel bombs on them like Bashir and Assad in Syria, then certainly these things still can have very deadly consequences. We only have to think back to the factory collapse in Bangladesh that killed over 1,000 people when the owners of that building, through connections with a politician, were able to give a very small bribe in order to get the building certified as structurally sound when in fact it wasn't. So even getting away from the issue of billions and billions of dollars, then even comparatively small bribes can end up with the deaths or suffering of many, many people. So to what extent should we adapt? Well, I think that there is some positive news. First off, in the early 1990s, discussing corruption in international policy circles was absolutely taboo. It just wasn't done. Okay? To the extent that corruption was discussed in academic circles, the opinion was, to the extent that there was an opinion at all, it wasn't studied too much, that maybe corruption's a good thing. It cuts through red tape, it makes it easier to get things done in systems that would otherwise be pretty inefficient. There's certainly been a sea change or a shift in opinion amongst academics and also amongst policymakers, and hence we do have international treaties there. And again, skeptics and cynics will say, well, look, we have international treaties on lots of things, but do they do any good? Do they make the world a better place? I think that, as I say, although there are big problems in the system, particularly in countries that are choosing not to do anything about it, we do have signs of hope. in certain key countries, and bear in mind, of course, that the United States, Switzerland and Britain jointly, between them, host the majority of the world's wealth. So if you are going to want any three countries to get religion on enforcing this rule, it is those three countries there. So I think what needs to happen is increasing pressure, first off, of the countries that have got religion. Unfortunately, not many, but as I say, the important ones. You've got a technical problem. How are you going to make the existing system work better? And those were some of the things I threw out towards the end. In other countries like Australia, you've got a political problem, not a technical problem. How can you get countries from saying the right things but not meaning it in order to do the right things there? So I think continued sort of pressure that got R2P on the agenda in the first place and then is being used to augment and enhance the effectiveness of R2P as well. I think there are a lot of parallels there between the movement for human rights and the movement to fight corruption.
We're coming up against time, but I think we have got time for 3 quick questions still. Samuel.
I think I really enjoyed it coming from Africa. I can really appreciate the problems these money laundering issues pose to people in Africa. My question is this. From your email, you stated that these agents try to acknowledge that the rules or the laws differ from different countries.
Yeah.
So perhaps today we're talking of Australia, that Australia is not being reactive in trying to send the monies back or trying to prosecute these people. Mm-hmm. We also acknowledge that the United States, the UK, and Switzerland are currently trying to do, their best to send these monies back. Perhaps 20, 30, 40, or 50 years ago, they knew that these monies were dirty monies, but they also thought of it contributing to their economic growth, immensely, so they didn't bother themselves at all. Mm-hmm. Currently, we are talking of Australia to prevent it. I'm very sure that once Australia does something to prevent this, there is always going to be a safe haven of such monies. So currently, Dubai is one of the safe places that Africans, politicians are trying to, buy a lot of, houses, trying to hold their monies there. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of, is there any way we can, have a policy to block the outflow of such monies rather than thinking of the reactive measures that countries should rather return it to the place that the money came from? That is my question.
Sure, thanks. I should say, the email I read for you for the guy, helpfully promising the anonymous structure that could be moved within minutes if we're required. Obviously, as I said, I conducted this via email. I didn't meet him. And then at a talk like this, but in the Bahamas, I met some guy before, and he gave me his business card, and the name of his company and the logo looked strangely familiar. And I looked at the email I just read you, and I realized, you're that guy. So I quickly had to cut that quote from my presentation. So I hope he's not in the audience. I haven't seen him. I hope he's not watching. Okay, so 2 problems that could be there. First off, as you raise a problem of displacement, even if Australia did the right place, there are enough dodgy places, the money would just go somewhere else. I should say almost every country in the world has signed up the UN Convention Against Corruption. I think New Zealand hasn't. It's one of the very few. I'm not sure why. New Zealand and North Korea. That may be just wrong, but for some reason New Zealand left it very, very late. The second one is a kind of arms race, and I referred to this a little bit. If you impose a certain system of surveillance or countermeasures, then criminals are smart people, or at least they can hire smart people if they're rich enough, and these kleptocrats can really hire the best lawyers in town, and do. So to what extent will we get sort of outflanked, or would our countermeasures count for naught? Well, I think that the displacement excuse is really not good enough, really, for any of the sort of international problems, okay? And you can look at this for things that have been around for a long while, like practices of extradition for criminals. You had the country in the Seychelles in the mid-1990s, 1996, that passed a law called the Economic Development Act, which said, if you have committed a crime anywhere in the world against anyone who is not a Seychelles citizen, we will let you live in the Seychelles and promise not to extradite you anywhere as long as you pay us $10 million, and we will give you citizenship, okay? This was the Economic Development Act. Not surprisingly, other countries went berserk and said, This is completely unacceptable. You're not allowed to provide yourself as a host or haven for international corruption proceeds. And this was more than just moral suasion. It was said to the Seychelles, to the extent that you do go through with this act, we are going to disconnect you from the international banking network such that to get money in and out of your countries, you literally will have to carry it in a suitcase in the same way that you did to get to money to Nauru up until quite recently as well. So I think neither morally nor practically is an excuse to say there's always going to be a haven, so it might as well be us. Okay? I think, as I say, for a whole series of reasons, that doesn't work. Secondly, the arms race. The problem now is we're not even catching the dumb criminals, the obvious ones. Okay? The criminal masterminds, the geniuses, they're probably always going to get away. We're not after a perfect system, we're just after a system that works a lot better than the one we have, which in Australia's case wouldn't be that hard. As I say, doesn't require more laws, doesn't require more money. So the arms race metaphor is really overdone. No doubt criminals are smart and will react, but we really have done such a poor job in many countries so far. There are such large gains that can be realised for a comparatively small cost, so it's just crazy that we don't do that, particularly when we've gone to the trouble of building up these huge and expensive systems of financial surveillance to do with anti-money laundering, the war on terror, the war on drugs, and so on.
Two more.
Hi, I just have a question in regards to multinational corporations. Ever since the end of the Cold War, they've no doubt had an important part in the interstate relations. How complicit do you think they are, if at all, in regards to this corruption, and do they actually facilitate this? Thank you.
Yes, is the short answer. It depends what kind of... So there's lots of different kinds of corruption out there, and I've concentrated my remarks on one this evening. So kleptocracy or grand corruption, which is rulers of states stealing money and generally putting it offshore. A separate, though often a related form of corruption is multinational firms bribing abroad, okay? Hence the scandal of Australian Wheat Board and the firms associated with the Reserve Bank. But to the extent that you're talking about multinational corporations, including banks and including law firms, which we don't tend to think of law firms as being multinational firms, and in fact many of them are multinational, or accountants, yes, they're some of the key gatekeepers. This is very much international finance. It's not a do-it-yourself business. Whether you've got clean money or dirty money, you hire a professional to do this. And those professionals in multinational firms. So definitely.
Did you have a question?
I was just going to ask Jason whether you've ever been threatened. Sorry? I just wanted to know, Jason, whether you've been threatened for any of your investigations over the years.
I did get a strange email after soliciting these requests from people in Belize, and a small country in Central America that sells a lot of offshore products. And they said, "Dear Dr. Sharman, we notice your email solicitation. We want you to tell us who wrote you that email so we can find them." And I said, "Well, according to my ethics guidelines, I can't tell you that. I've deleted all the names." And they said, "Well, we think you're making it up, so we're going to sue you for defamation unless you give us those names." And this caused me some concern at the time. I went to see a lawyer who I thought would make me feel better, but in fact made me feel worse in a couple of ways. First off, he pointed out that if you get sued for defamation, they get all of your money in your house and your superannuation. As an academic, I get to keep my laptop and my books. I like my laptop and my books, but not that much. Secondly, the lawyer said, "Well, getting sued for defamation is probably on the good end of the bad things that can happen to you. But fortunately, this was a while ago, and I'm still here, so hopefully not too many more threats." As I say, really it's not the kind of having your legs broken one, it's more the defamation one that's a problem, particularly in countries like Australia and Britain.
I'd now like to invite Professor Haig Pashapan to give the vote of thanks.
Hi everyone. I have to use both microphones, so excuse me. It's my distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege and pleasure to offer the vote of thanks for Jason Sharman's presentation this evening. Jason, I know how much you dislike corruption, and part of the duties of this rhetorical position is to flatter you with admirable comments, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to tell you the truth, Parisia, but of course I know flatterers will say that to you anyway. But I do want to offer you a vote of thanks 3 times over. So I want to quickly go through the 3 votes of thanks, if I may. The first is to thank you for giving us a masterclass in engaged scholarship, as I would put it. You know, there's an extraordinary amount of pressure on scholars to have blog entries, to have Twitter accounts, to have all sorts of engagement. The reality is that engagement for the sake of engagement really makes no sense for us. We cannot compete with people who have web presence of 20 million likes. The way we can engage, and really the only way we can engage, is precisely the way Jason has demonstrated us. It actually involves a lot of hard work, and in his case, potential breaking of legs and litigation. A lot of interviews, a lot of lonely, hard research that issues in thoughtful scholarship, and Jason has demonstrated to us exactly what this means. So Jason, thank you for showing us exactly what true engagement means. The second vote of thanks is for what I've learnt this evening. I hadn't realized how extensively the international community has changed in the area of corruption. And there's been a sea change, and you demonstrated in a profound way why this sea change has taken place and the implication of this for all of us. The other important insight you provided for me was, I always thought Australia had clean hands. It now seems that we have clean hands because we do a lot of laundry. I'm not sure if your hope that we have a huge scandal will solve the problem, but you've certainly initiated something of the sort. The third vote of thanks relates to something a bit more complicated. You made me think about corruption and the meaning of corruption. So I wondered, what are my thoughts about corruption? And indeed, not just my thoughts, but what are the general public's opinion about corruption? And when I reflected on this, it struck me that we actually have a very complex and ambiguous view towards corruption. So let me give you, and indulge me, with 2 examples. I want to start off with the everyday garden version of corruption. Willie Sutton, when he asked why he was a bank robber, he's a notorious bank robber in America in the 1930s, he said, you know, why do you rob banks? And his answer was, because that's where the money is. And, you know, a standard line. But the thing that got me about that old saying of Willie Sutton's is, he got upset that people quoted him on this, because he thought he wasn't that corrupt. He thought there were more reasons for robbing banks than the fact that there's money in it. So what are those reasons? So let me start with my first example. And the first example I would call, in the spirit of Miss Marple, the case of the flashing lights. When I come to work every morning, I go through lots of school zones, and as you all know, when you go through school zones, the speed limit goes from 60 or 50 to 40, and you have to be careful. The other day when I did this, a car going the other way, driven by a woman who I assumed had dropped off her daughters at the school, flashed her lights at me. Now, we all know what that means, correct? Who doesn't know what this means? It means there's a police radar, and this woman's being very helpful. She was helping me. And I have to confess, and I have to be careful, I know there are some police officers in the room tonight. I was grateful that she did this. Now, I found this action completely illogical, because the rule had been designed to benefit her daughters, and it was for her safety, and yet she was flashing, trying to undermine this very sensible rule, and I was conspiring in this act by saying thank you to her. I didn't know what was going on, to be honest. Now, that may seem like not grand corruption, but on the spectrum, kind of trivial corruption, but if you are involved in any way with insurance companies, you'll know that this reappears and costs a lot of money. you know, the terrible thing happens. Someone burgles your home, you feel your precious objects have been taken. This is a terrible experience. How horrible is it that we have such corrupt people in the world? And once the insurance claim is put in, surprise, surprise, we add a few items to the insurance policy claim. How is it that human beings can do such contradictory things and without flinching, it seems? The moral aspect of this seems really curious to me. So that's first, the first question. The second and final one I want to raise is what I would call the Jason Sharman problem. This, by the way, is reminiscent of the Adam Smith problem that German scholars are beguiled by. You know, the tension between Adam Smith's teaching and the theory of moral sentiments as opposed to the wealth of nations. So what is the Jason Sharman problem? As you've comprehensively demonstrated, Jason, corruption would be negligible, if not non-existent, if it wasn't aided and abetted by otherwise thoughtful, intelligent, very well-educated and competent professionals such as bankers, accountants, financial advisors, and lawyers. But why do some people readily provide their services while others, such as Jason Sharman, don't? Now, I have no doubt that some people with no sense of humor, or perhaps large amounts of money, would see Jason's amusing title, Despot's Guide to Wealth Management, as a job application. Jason, I think, would make a perfect counselor for corrupt people. I have Hollywood proof for this. I've seen a movie called Catch Me If You Can. And if you've seen this movie, you'll see that FBI, in the form of Tom Hanks, realized that Leo DiCaprio, acting as Frank Abagnale, who was a brilliant forger, that as a brilliant forger, he's the best catcher of forgers. So he ends up employing him. And, you know, it's a tale of salvation and recovery. But couldn't the arrow of direction go the other way? Why isn't Jason, who's so knowledgeable about corruption, actually be the best counselor for these people? What stops Jason from not being a counselor? It's certainly not the amount of money we pay you, Jason. I suspect the pay of a professor would be maybe a daily cost for the super yacht that you described that one of these people had. So actually the mystery remains for me. And it's not just a trivial mystery, because if we can solve this question of legitimacy and justice and all those things related to corruption, I think we could go some way to addressing the larger concern you raised tonight about political will and how scandals might force Australia at least to initiate important action. But one thing I am grateful for is the fact that Jason is actually on the side of the good guys. So Jason, don't take this as an endorsement to change career paths. So that concludes my threefold vote of thanks. I want to also thank our distinguished guests, school board members, Griffith executives, and high school teachers and students. Thank you to all those who are unable to attend the event in person but joined us virtually on Facebook and YouTube. Please join us now in the Griffith Art Gallery, which is just next door, for refreshments. You'll also be one of the first people to view the new exhibition entitled Sweet Chariot by Smirning Gill. So thank you, Jason.